When author Craig Davidson took a job driving a school bus for kids with special needs, he did it because he needed a job. As the school year unfolded, he found more than a paycheck. He found kinship, strength, insight, and a bus full of his fellow nerds. He details his evolving journey with them all in his memoir, Precious Cargo, My Year Driving the Kids on School Bus 3077. Craig Davidson joins us now. Welcome.
Thank you, Nam. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to speak to you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
I enjoyed this book. So I wanted to ask you about what life was like for you before you started driving the school bus. It was full of ups and downs, correct?
Yeah, and I think probably at the time it was more downs than ups. I was a failure. This is how I contextualize myself, and I go into in the early chapters of the book is I was a writer, and I had put out 2 books, one of which did okay, the other of which tanked abysmally, and it was all my fault.
So how was it your fault? Sorry.
Well, you know, I guess when you write a book, it's a solitary endeavor. It's you and the page, and so when something doesn't work, the finger of blame really only points to one person. That's the person holding the pen. So, or at least that's how I contextualize it. But I did have editors and I did have an agent, neither of whom I really listened to. You know, I felt like I think I was 28, 29 when I was writing the book, and it was a lot of hubris on my part thinking, even if you guys don't understand what I'm doing, I know what I'm doing. I know that I'm going to make this work. And afterwards, when the book comes out and you realize you've made a colossal mistake and hadn't listened when you should have, then that only intensifies kind of those feelings of shame and worry about being here. You're 30 years old. You're looking down the barrel of a very long life as a failure. And that's how I sort of saw myself. And then you see yourself like, I worked so hard to be good at this, and I failed. What could I possibly do, you know, putting this much kind of ambition and forward momentum towards a goal, and if I'm still not good enough to reach it, what am I good enough to do? So that's where I found myself.
I think it's interesting that you considered yourself a failure. You weren't even 30 and you had 2 books. I mean, not many people can even have a book their whole life.
Yeah, you know, and I suppose there's that now looking back retrospectively now as a 40-year-old. There's a lot of stuff that you feel as a younger person, I guess, that doesn't resonate, and you realize that you were kind of not in your right head. But whether or not I can look back now, at the time, that's how I contextualize myself. And it took itself out in all sorts of ways. I became really isolated. I didn't go out. I took out a lot on my parents who were living there at the time. And there's no people you can take for granted more than your parents, you know what I mean? And they deserve it the least of all, and yet you kind of are the hardest on them sometimes when you're having a rough time. So I just wasn't a fun person to be around. And that's kind of and I was scuffling for work too. I was, you know, I had a house, but I was kind of getting close to defaulting on my mortgage. So there were a lot of pressures, all of which I felt that I'd heaped on myself.
And even to 30, when you hear 30, it's like, dun, dun, dun. Right?
Yeah, yeah. And I didn't have a girlfriend. I didn't have a relationship. I didn't have children. I felt like I could put all those things off until I was a success in my given field. And then to find out that you'd kind of isolated yourself and worked so hard towards a given goal, and then to have that blow up in your face, and then look around at your friends who had relationships and have kids and have all the things that you thought you would get later, you just feel like you're so far behind your growth curve.
Yeah, I've been there. It's
Right.
suffocating.
It is.
So you start taking a series of jobs. You lose some jobs, like the library.
Right.
And the day that you come home, you had, you know, a debacle of an interview.
Yes.
You come home and you find a flyer. And so what happens next?
Well, yeah, I pulled it out and took a look at it, and it was the bus company, First Student Canada, basically soliciting applicants through putting leaflets in everyone's mailbox strung down my street. And to me, it was like a life preserver. It was like, here is a perfect job for me, because I thought, okay, I can still write. I can get up in the morning, drive, you know, 50-odd kids to school in one of these big old buses, come home, do my writing, go out in the afternoon, pick them up, come back. So it was a perfect kind of part-time arrangement that I thought was ideal. All I had to do is get the job.
And I want to talk about the kids on the bus in a little bit.
Sure.
But what were you like as a young child?
What was I like? Well, I mean, I was an overweight, red-haired class clown. You know, that was kind of my thing. I realized you kind of do a self-appraisal, even as a kid, like, well, what am I best suited to be here? I certainly wasn't a jock. I certainly wasn't a cool kid.
Yeah.
And I had a facility to make people laugh, and I had no problem with making a fool of myself for other people's amusement. So yeah, that was kind of my niche that I found myself in for not just as a child, but on into high school and even into university, kind of as like the funny guy. And then after a while, I realized that maybe that wasn't I was maybe a bit more introverted than all that. So it seemed like writing was a more natural way of kind of expressing my creativity, but not kind of in a class clownish way.
And I guess as a class clown, people expect certain things from you, right?
Yeah, it kind of felt exhausting sometimes, you know, but I'm sure like the star athlete or any of those little boxes that you get put in high school probably all feel exhausting. You go back to your home at the end of the day and just like, you can take off that kind of robe that you're wearing of who you are, your niche that you fill in your high school, and just be who you really are. So yeah, it got to be exhausting trying to make people laugh, and I certainly had a lot of coming to grips with the idea of like being a comedian in real life would be a very difficult. You can see why a lot of them are depressed.
They drink and depressed,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you get this job. What kind of, were you surprised to get the job, and what kind of training did they give you?
I found that the leaflet was a good example. Like they clearly were looking for applicants. You know, even on the back of buses, you'll see if you look at a school bus, you'll say, call this number, looking for drivers. I mean, they're always looking for drivers. It's one of those kind of positions or jobs where there's a fairly big turnover for any number of reasons. So the job itself was fine. She was the supervisor, or sorry, the job. The one who was offering me the job wanted to give me the job as badly as I wanted it, so it was a case of mutual desperation. So yeah, I got hired and did a very intensive training. You know, for even as badly as they want you as a driver, they don't want to let you get on the road unless you have the right disposition and prove that you can actually handle one of these buses, which is an enormous. A big bus is like an enormous vehicle to drive around, obviously, and I did a lot of training in like downtown Calgary, and there were some white knuckle rides there because the back of the bus will swing out like a good 4 to 5 feet. So if you're not careful with the way you're steering around corners, you can do a lot of damage. So there was a very intensive training, and passed my licensing, and then it came to the route assignments.
And we're going to talk about that in a second, but what image did you have about bus drivers before you took the job?
Right. Well, probably the same that most people have, which is, I took the bus to school in high school, and my bus driver was, I'm sure, very nice, but she was kind of a faceless entity who, she got on the bus, and you would only fall under her scrutiny if you were chucking orange peels at somebody's head or like causing a disturbance, basically, and that was the only time that she would really bother to interact with you. So I guess I felt like there was a certain sense of, first of all, too, I was 30 years old, and I thought, I'm way too young to be doing this. I always thought bus drivers are like older, and they have sciatica, and they smoke, big, long, skinny cigarettes, before getting on the bus. So I was definitely going through a point in my life where I thought, it was shocking to me that I was doing it, but at the same point I realized I needed this job desperately, and I was grateful to have it.
And at some point, they actually kind of gave you an out as far as what route you would take, but you took this particular route. Why?
Yeah. Well, like a great many things in my life, Nam, it was a snap decision, and some of those have gone very well, and some of them have gone dismally. But in this case, my route assignment coordinator was just firing off different routes, and there were a couple that would have involved big buses, but they were further away from my home, and the one nearest to me, geographically, was a small bus for 5 children with special needs. And that was the one that I ended up choosing after what was, to be honest, in the book I say a beat. She offers me the route and then a beat, which, in a screenwriting is like just somebody takes a moment to reflect and think about their next words. And I did. It was a long beat. And I finally said, yes,
Why did you
let's do that.
hesitate?
Well, I think for the same reason a lot of people would hesitate, is that I wasn't sure I'd be the right person to do that route, to work with those kids, because I'd had nothing in my own life that corresponded to that experience. You know, I didn't have anybody in my immediate family who had anything that could be seen as a cognitive disability or a delay or a physical disability. The closest thing, as I write in the book, is I have an in-law who fell down the stairs when she was very young and ended up having some trauma to her head and to her brain. But really, there was nothing very close and intimate to me that I'd have much experience with that. And I thought, oh, it would be so much easier in some ways just to drive a big bus and be the faceless bus driver. But at the other point, I thought, this is a wonderful opportunity, perhaps. And if I'm not the right person, listen, I will just beg off the route. I will at some point just say, you know what, it's probably best that I take a different route. And I knew that I always had that kind of as a fail-safe.
What kind of disabilities, even using the word disability, it's awkward.
It's tough to get the right word, isn't it?
Yeah.
I struggle with that writing the book too, is how to best frame these sorts of discussions. Yeah.
What kind of disabilities did the children have?
Well, they were kind of all different. Jake was in a wheelchair. He had cerebral palsy, which is kind of a disability or a condition that is usually present from birth, and it can get gradually kind of worse as that child, develops. And Gavin had what on the route assignment was said autism, but his parents eventually told me, no, he actually has something called Fragile X, which is the same condition that Oliver had, which is a condition, kind of a specific condition, that affects growth and, intellectual development. And then Nadja and Vincent, the other two students, had what would just be called delays. It wasn't very specific what their condition was. It was just that they were perhaps behind the curve intellectually from others in their same age cohort.
And you had I want to talk about some of your relationships with all the children individually, but you had a specific relationship with Jake.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I can. I feel like I'm not divulging secrets or anything. That's one of the things about the memoir. I've been a fiction writer, so it's very interesting going into this process and recognizing that you're dealing with kids and their families and trying to be compassionate and honest.
You changed the names too, right?
I did, yeah. All the names were changed. But Jake, basically 4 months before I started driving, Jake and his mother were out for a walk. He was in his wheelchair and his mother was walking with him. And they were out with a family friend and their daughter, Jake's sister. And a drunk driver in a giant truck came down and struck them, specifically struck Jake and his mother. And his mother passed away pretty much instantly. And Jake was knocked out of his wheelchair as the truck just charged on away. And he was put into a medically induced coma for 2 weeks, and he had vast and very severe injuries. So he came out of it, and that was the first day that I picked him up would be his first school day.
Wow.
Following this immense personal tragedy. And that was one of the major things, Nam, that I grappled with, is that it feels like to me some people, like just fate and like suffering, because it feels like some people, some families seem to be like anointed for a degree of suffering that feels so completely out of whack and unfair with other people. You know what I mean? And I don't think it's something I'll ever come to grips with, but it was something that I struggled with, and I was forced to kind of look at and see how Jake and his family dealt with, persevered through. It's difficult though at some level to grapple with that level of endurance and perseverance. And one of the things he always said was like, I'm so happy and I have no idea why. But there were other days where like it was rough. You could tell he came out to the bus. and he was just sunk in a deep kind of pit of despair, which is completely fair and obvious. And his father would come on, and they always had this thing where his father would put his hand around the back of his son's head and push their foreheads together, and just be positive. And it was I think now as a father myself, what an immense personal strength that entire family needed. Calvin having lost his wife, and Josh and Molly having lost their lost their mother. But yet every day they were there, and every day they were showing like resiliency that I found absolutely amazing.
And what about the other kids? You include them too in an interstitial, I guess, that you would call The Seekers.
Right. Yeah. Like kind of a book within a book.
Yeah.
Well, all of them. What amazed me on the bus is that they were all storytellers. You know, they were absolutely. They loved to tell stories, and the stories were illuminating as to who they were. I think from an adult looking at these kids, you recognize that like. Their stories were interesting in their own right, but they were also revelatory of who they were and their hopes and their ambitions and their dreams. And so, Nadia would tell stories about, princesses and, heroines. And Vincent would tell stories about, basically about like cybernetic creatures, and he was like a super technologically kind of fascinated boy. And Oliver would tell lies, basically, as I say. He
Joey.
was just an enormous, right. He had this friend, Joey, who was like the uber butt kicker.
Yeah.
He was like the toughest guy you'd ever want to meet. No one ever seen Joey. We knew at some point Joey didn't exist. But Joey was a manifestation of who Oliver wanted to be, or wanted to, this protector,
And
because
Joey,
the kids were picked on quite a bit, or from time to time. Sorry, you're going to say.
No, I was just saying that Joey had biceps called Thunder and Gus.
Right. Well, I swear, Nam, I didn't laugh so hard that year. The belly laughter was such that, and these kids were just funny. Like they were just hilariously funny, and they knew they were funny, and they got each other rolling in the aisles, and they got me rolling in the aisles to the point that sometimes I really did have to pull the bus over because I was feared for, making sure we kept on the straight and narrow down the road.
Well, you brought up talking about bullying. Do you think that because the kids were on a different bus that made them targets? Why did they need to take a different bus?
Well, that was something I struggled with wondering myself, because it's kind of like the scarlet letter, the short bus, as some people would call it. It's called a busette in actual, bus driver terminology. And I thought, for example, why couldn't, Jake was in normal grade 12 classes with his peers, but he had to ride this bus simply because it had the wheelchair ramp, and so why couldn't all the kids just be filtered out into separate routes and just ride a big bus, for example? And they could have, but what I came to realize throughout the book is that the kids on my bus anyways were okay being on that bus and being in the classes that they were in. It's not that they didn't rail against it sometimes. It's not that they weren't hyper aware of sometimes this difference of they got off the little bus and they went to their own class, whereas everybody else got off the big buses and went to disperse through the rest of the school to the other classes. But despite that, at other times they were completely content, happy, and I think most importantly aware of the situation that existed, and they were much better dealing with it than I was at dealing with it.
Yeah, how did you handle the bullying?
Not well, not well, especially at first. I got in some physical confrontations with people over it. And what I ultimately had to accept is that these kids didn't like that. I think, as I write in the book, me doing those sorts of things was forcing them to listen to a frequency that they had learned how to tune out. And it was the frequency of pure ignorance, of people being ignoramuses and being cruel, and I think Jake said it at one point. He said, life's tough, but it's tougher if you're stupid. And he was saying that to refer to all the people who would be, dismissively cruel or just ignorant about the lives that those kids were living. So I had to learn just to I could never accept it, and to this day I can't accept it, and to this day my back gets up about certain things, but I didn't actually react in such a way that would draw attention to it.
I wanted to read you a passage from the book that relates to this. There would always be pointers and laughers. When we see this in children, it's understandable. But the year of bus driving taught me that far too many of us reach adulthood still thinking there's something inherently hilarious about disabilities. How common is it to mock people with disabilities in this day and age?
Well, I think less and less, thank heavens, you know. I think as a society we're just becoming more enlightened about all sorts of things. But it's weird because, for example, like, people wouldn't make a racial slur. Like, I mean, people do, obviously, but I think that is known as to be verboten. And if you do that, if you do it in the earshot of someone who you are slurring, they will come over and upbraid you over it, or it could get physical. Whereas if you say something cruel in the proximity of someone with a disability, maybe you think that nothing's going to come of it because that person is not going to be able to stick up for themselves or speak for themselves, or not even be aware in some cases that they've been slighted. So, but I do think obviously we are making great strides, but I do think there's much, because I was talking to somebody who is an advocate for, you know, disabled people and their families, and she said that, you know, when a disabled person is pictured, say, in a commercial, the company that's doing that makes a big deal about it. And you know, she said, why should it? That's just a normal family unit. Why should that be drawn attention to as though they're doing something very, like, socially forward and noble? It's a lovely thing, but at the same point, we should just see that as that's just a normal family doing a normal thing.
Right, right. And even like the R word, you talk about it a bit.
Yeah.
And, you know, like the Black Eyed Peas had a song that was like, let's
Yeah.
get,
Exactly.
you know.
Let's get it started as it became, but yeah.
How did your experience with these kids teach you about that word?
Well, that it hasn't gone away, and that, you know, I was out playing basketball, pickup ball, with, like, guys my age, 40 years old, smart guys, like family men, and one of them just popped off with that word, and, you know, you just think you would never use the N word, you would never use any other word, but yet there's still kind of a gray, gauzy area where you think you can use the R word, you know, in certain social situations, and, you know, and I called him out on it. Like, that's just not cool. There's no need to use that word. It has no applicability here. So,
and it hurts.
It's hurtful. It's deeply hurtful. So, yeah, it's a difficult thing to navigate. And you wish it wouldn't be that way. But it's, obviously, it's still, there's all sorts of stuff that's still in our society. We haven't kind of evolved, but I think we are getting better.
Are you still in touch with the kids?
I'm in touch with Jake especially. The other kids, well, it's funny, I thought about it. You know, what if I'd gone up and knocked on Oliver's door in the summer and been like, hey, you want to go out for a game of catch? And his mom in the back going like, you're the bus driver. That's weird, actually, you know? So it was like the bus that drew us all together and made it actually fundamentally acceptable that a 32-year-old would be hanging out with, you know, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. So I look at it more like, you've probably had experiences like this, like me, it's tree planting or summer camp or certain summer jobs. It's like, it's an intense experience where you are drawn together with a disparate group of people and you form really close bonds and have, like, really intense experiences. And then, but there's always a deadline on it. It's the end of summer, it's the end of camp, it's the end of the work term. And then you guys just fling off on your separate orbits. But it doesn't mean that the intensity of the experience is lessened in any way or that the memories are any less vivid. But Jake, yeah, the last time I was in Calgary, we went out for dinner and shot a breeze with each other, and it's wonderful. It's one of those things that, as I say, when you're a good friend, you can be apart for a while and it doesn't matter. You sit down and all those years kind of evaporate.
It's like you talked yesterday.
It's back where you were.
At the beginning of the memoir, you were talking about this difficult time that you were going in, and I'm guessing your definition of success was very different after you spent this year with the kids. How do you define success now?
Yeah, the terms have definitely been altered. You know, I think it's a difficult question because it's so complex. But I think ultimately it's acceptance. You know, it's acceptance. That year taught me acceptance of my own limitations, of what I can expect of myself, really. And also that, like, you don't have to realize your dreams in kind of this 100% perfect kind of expression of what you thought they were going to be when you were in your 20s. Like, you can't hold yourself accountable for those dreams, you know? And if you do, you're gonna lose out on so many other wonderful opportunities in your life because you don't think you're ready to, you know, sort of embrace them. So I wouldn't have been a husband, I wouldn't have been a father, which give me, to be honest, much more joy than writing does. As much as I love writing and I see myself as a writer, and I guess I contextualize myself career-wise as a writer, it doesn't give me joy. Joy comes from the places that it always was. You know, the friendships and love of the people that you care for and that care for you. And writing, or whatever your career path, is a very minor part of that. It's important, and I would never discount it. Yeah, I mean, basically, to be honest, Nam, it turned me into an adult. You know, I had a very late-breaking charge towards adulthood, and driving this bus was the driving kind of influence of it.
And there's a great line in the book about the title of the book, Why Call It Precious Cargo?
Right. Well, that is actually in the bus driver's vernacular, that's the legal term for what we are driving. We are, as my instructor said, we're not driving potatoes here, people. We are driving precious cargo.
Craig Davidson, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much,
It was a
Nam.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.